Okay, guys, I feel like we all have our own little pregame ritual to get in the zone to optimize our performance on this podcast. I'm going to let you in on my secret. I do methylated B12 vitamins. It's just like pure flow state.
It always turns your teeth red.
Yeah, but I'm operating.
You can always tell
I go
when you're
from
doing
like
it.
5% brain capacity to like 6%. It's game changer. What is y'all's hack?
Oh, shit. To prepare for a podcast?
Yeah, or a big interview or an athletic endeavor.
These are all different things.
Race poops. Just shit your brains
You
out.
did use the restroom right before we started this.
You have a race poop, though.
Get ahead of the poopy chills.
Yeah, I did not.
That's a good one. Okay, Robby, what about you? What's your secret? Don't hold back.
Oh, man.
Share this with the world.
I think, obviously, I study and research and nerd out because I'm like, I don't want to say something wrong and I want to maximize the opportunity. But like right before this podcast, I was just pacing around the parking lot having meetings legitimately. So I can't say I did anything badass other than it's like in the 40s and I spent the last hour walking in circles.
Jeez. So Robby actually does hard work to prepare for something. He doesn't just try to hack his way into a performance.
He's the most prepared man.
Maybe there's something we should learn
here
from
for
that.
sure.
The original biohack.
Preparation.
Preparation and hard work. Okay, guys. So we have gathered today for a very important conversation. And this is one that I've been nagging you guys to please come into the studio and record because I think it's going to be so legendary and fun. And it's one that we should have had months ago. But I think we all agree that there's an ongoing trend towards unbalanced communications, anti-meat, let us call it hysteria in the media, academic policies, government policy circles. I think it first started, at least when I look back in time, saturated fat was maybe public enemy number one in like the 60s. And then it was like cholesterol. And then meat was vilified as being terrible for the environment. And we've been able to understand and talk through and reason our way out of those moments of separation from nature and our own hysterical mindsets. But now we're confronted with this underlying notion that meat is bad for the planet in the sense that we cannot grow a population. We cannot feed ourselves with meat, let alone regenerative meat. The question is, can we feed ourselves with a more virtuous system, period? And so with that being said, just one word answer, and then we're going to dive into this. Can you feed a population or whatever? If someone wants to say, can we save the planet? Can you feed the world better eating meat? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Obviously.
I polled a couple people, and out of 10 people I asked, all 10 said no. This is that was a little bit of a bro math thing, but this is probably
Who did you poll?
Just people.
People.
Call them out. Name them. We're coming for you.
It's
people.
HIPAA policy. I can't reveal that information. But my point is, I think we've all been in this industry long enough to have people constantly question. They say regenerative is wonderful. Eating meat has tremendous benefits for our human health, for the health of our ecosystem, whatever. But we can't scale this. This is unscalable to feed a growing population. And so this is what we're going to dive into.
I think there's a couple prongs there too. I think I would expand on meat. I think we got to talk about meat. We started this company which sells meat to address this problem and many others, but I think we also say this isn't, about plant-based or animal-based. This is like planet-based systems and solutions. And so I think we should talk about food at large in parts of this too. And can we feed a global population with regenerative systems, with plants and animals in harmony and thriving ecosystems producing our food?
I just don't love the question. I don't love the question of like, can we feed a growing population? It's like, well, should we be feeding a growing population? Like, should? Is this?
Well, let's get into that because that's a really provocative one. First, before we get there, let's just talk about our current industrial state of agriculture and what that looks like. Specifically, I think I want to pay attention to row crops, which they tend to get the pass, like this plant-based system. There's this narrative that that's better than an animal-based system. So what does that look like? And can that feed a growing population? So let's start with where we are. What's the reality of that?
I like that you're looking at Robby because you know he's prepared. Robby?
This is going to be so fun. We're going to go all over the place and zig and zag and go deep, and we're going to have to pull ourselves out of the weeds. But yeah, like I think, we all do podcasts and we do other interviews and things. And we get asked the question a lot. And I think I always like to push back on the premise of the question. It's like, can regenerative or meat, can you feed a growing population? And I always want to remind everybody, like, that's a fair question to ask, but a more important question to ask is, can the current system feed a global population? And what are the implications of that? And I think the definitive answer to that is no. The current system, we talk a lot about it, so I'll try not to be too redundant. I know we're all gonna we could talk an hour on it. But I think the current system exploded in productivity with the Green Revolution in response to a desire to improve yield, like really well-intentioned things. How do we create more food, make it more cost-effective? How do we respond to coming out of like World War II about, food shortages and, some really terrible political policies in places like China and Russia that led to mass famine and starvation events. And then, the Green Revolution followed, and we figured out how to make, certain types of food in massive quantities really cheaply. We'll expand on that in a second, but I think part of that reality has been, it's like a reductionism, a simplification. It's like we make the food that we make is grains, cheap seed oils and, cheap corn. And that may be producing calories, but it's not producing nutrition. And as a result of the Green Revolution, that explosion of productivity plateaued and is plateauing right now. So like we can't expect the same productivity curve to continue. In fact, what we're seeing with desertification and with many of the other externalities we'll talk about is that the benefits are waning to that reality. I think you've also replaced famine with nutrient deficiency. So like 2 billion people in the world, a quarter of the population are deficient in key nutrients. And so this system may be filling bellies, but it's depriving people of nutrition and health. It's destroying ecosystems. It's putting toxic chemicals in our food and water. Talked about erosion and a lot of times and the loss of topsoil. So the actual food system, again, is not just productivity gains aren't there. We're actually going to see productivity declines and up to and including full loss of productivity at the rate we're destroying our food production systems with the status quo, which will cause massive food security, food stability issues. The list goes on and on and on and on about why the current system is not a solution. I think there's things I'd love to dive into, like how did we get here? And to Katie's point too, like, should we be feeding a growing population? Is the population even growing? And if so, how and where and why? Again, all of this nuance matters. I know we love reductionism in the year 2023, but there's so much to unpack here. But I think just like I would want to start off and say, the current system's broken. We're racing towards a cliff. Slowing down does nothing. We need to course correct. What's the best alternative?
I think that's an interesting point because if someone is saying we need to eat less meat to do better for the planet or whatever, to feed a growing population, then everything you just outlined, if we're consuming less of Mother Nature's most nourishing food source, then we have to eat something. We're not going to starve to death. So then we become more dependent on that alternative system, which you just described as kind of like that monoculture plant-based industrial system, which is predicated on inputs and controlling and dominating nature. And so that's an interesting perspective when you say like, you need to eat less meat, but you can eat more of this trash that I know is bad.
And again, it's like the system is making people sick. It's making them less fertile, and we're living shorter lives. So like, where does this head?
I want to know, when we say like, can we feed a growing population this way? I'm curious, like, what country does the global population rely on so heavily for their food? Is it the USA? Is it where is the global food supply coming from? Is it the United States? And why is it if so, is it the responsibility of the United States to be feeding the globe?
I mean, I think that those are totally fair and great questions. I think you're looking at me like I have that answer.
I figured, look at your notes.
I think as I understand it, the answer is it comes from everywhere. It's a global food system. You know what I mean?
Is there
I don't think food's all that different than the technology that we're speaking into or having our, bags or, the house goods and plastics and all the other. I mean, we live in a global society with global supply chains. And I think what the U.S. does is produce an unbelievable amount of like GMO corn and soy.
Yeah.
I think
and wheat.
I think we've been sued in international markets for flooding those markets with those specific crops at a price of less than the cost of production. So I think that's like a big part of our contribution. There are different parts of the world, like, going into this whole Ukraine debacle, I think, and Russia, like they produce a lot of the materials necessary to make fertilizer that goes into feeding the world. So it's not even just where does the food come from, but where do the inputs come from and where do the fossil fuels come from? If our current industrial system that's so efficient takes 10 calories of fossil fuels to produce 1 calorie of food, where is the fossil fuels coming from? And then looking at all of that too, who has incentives to perpetuate that stuff? And so I think, Kay, to your point, like not just where is food coming from today, but then we're talking about the foundation of the question of feeding a growing population is future-based. Like where are we headed and how do we feed it for the future? And it's like, well, the systems that are producing food today are degrading, so we're going to need some alternatives unless we improve those. And populations are rapidly changing. You're going to see, at some point over the next 50 years, we're going to begin to see population declines in North America, China, all of Europe, South America. Population will continue to increase for a few more years or decades. But the only place that population will continue to increase, by the year 2100 is the countries within Africa. And so like, how does that, like to your question, like how does it work now is relevant, but also like what all is going to change and how does that shift to meet the target where we're headed? I don't know, but to me, what's more important is the systems that we're degrading that are working we're relying on at present were chosen and are the systems we're relying on at present because they are the best. They're the lowest hanging fruit. They're the best, most fertile, most appropriate for food production. If we have to start to evaluate alternatives for those, we're going to second, third rate solutions. I think the focus and energy should be how do we improve, how do we regenerate, restore, rebuild the systems that we've been relying on to support a population growth from back, 2 billion people back in the 50s to 8 billion people now, so 6 billion people. I think that's come on the backs of those food systems, and then over the next 80 years, getting to 2100, they're expecting the population to grow only 2 billion people.
So let's stay on the topic of feeding a growing population, and is that even our moral obligation to do so, or our responsibility? One of my favorite books that I ever read was it's called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. You remember that? You know where I'm going with this?
Yes.
It was just so profound. My little 20-year-old mind read this and it just stuck with me since. But they're talking about population growth and food production. But the industrial food production, which devastates Mother Nature and our natural resources. And the idea that the author brought forth was that if we continue to feed a growing population, if we continue to feed people on the planet that are starving, then we're only perpetuating the problem, because then we're artificially inflating these communities where people probably shouldn't be living due to maybe they don't have the environment, maybe they don't have water, maybe they don't have the nutrient resources, maybe the contamination, maybe the carrying capacity of the land is exceeded. And so by continuing to feed those populations, you're only perpetuating the ability of those populations to further reproduce.
It literally sounds like you're talking about our bison herd right now.
Yeah, that's another point. Like, where in nature does that happen? What other species on the planet continues to reproduce disproportionately to what the resources can provide?
Nowhere.
What is that? What is the term people are talking about now? It's not
The
extinctionism.
extinctionist.
Is it extinctionism or extinctionist?
I know when Taylor was saying that, I was like, oh no, he sounds like an extinctionist.
No, I don't know what that even is, but I'm definitely not an extinctionist.
No, I think your point is, and we in talking, not that I want to make your point for you, but I think what I'm hearing you say is, when we talk about regenerative, we always talk about harmony, balance, cycle, evolutionarily consistent realities, and the ability to fit your food system to your population is a uniquely human thing versus fit your population to your food system or your environment. And it's a result of domination of nature such that you can synthetically curate an imbalance. And that clearly has a limit. And it has a limit for the globe. It has a limit for continents and countries and, subregions all the way down to Rome Ranch. So I don't think we're talking extinctionism. I think we're just talking maybe, biology.
Okay. So let's, definitely not talking about extinctionism, whatever the hell that is.
I don't even know if that's a word.
I think it's a new word.
But so like if we're looking at, the globe, not all land is created equal. Different regions have different contexts, different weather, different rain, different soil types. I think there's something important to like that celebrating the regional abundance. But what does that look on a global scale? And how do you determine kind of like what agricultural systems are most conducive for certain areas?
So I think you do the best job of talking about this sometimes in tours, and you're talking about trying to grow like bananas in the Arctic, or trying to, grow things that thrive in the cold and
polar bears in Texas.
Yeah, there you go. See, Taylor wins. And so I think again, if we're trying to dominate the system and force our will upon it, you start to do really unnatural things like that, where it makes more sense that systems would be regional. And I think that's like the best reality is like small, closed loop systems, like all the inputs and all the outputs are staying within the system on a land base as much as possible. Again, we're in a global society now with global supply chains, and we've disrupted those closed loops. And so I think there's a certain reality, and a certain part of the solution has to be turning back some of those or reversing some of those inefficiencies and replacing them with more efficient closed loop, small food system resilient solutions. I think the other part of it, and maybe this is the question, Katie, that you were asking too, is what is the current system and how are people currently fed? And it's not what you think. Like this idea of feeding the world, whether it's a growing world or just feeding the world, is a totally Western thing. And it goes back to that green revolution that I was talking about. The reality is today, 80% of the world's food comes from family farms. And 3/4 of all farms on the planet are smaller than 1 hectare, which is like 2.5 acres for Americans. So most of humanity today is eating food from small farms and small closed loop systems to some extent. Well, I don't want to say small closed loop systems. I'll say small farms. And it's the developed nations that eat this industrially farmed food. And it's the developed nations that are getting sicker and they're losing their fertility, and the populations actually aren't going to be growing as much as they have been and should begin, are predicted to begin to decline. And it's also, again, this idea of feeding the world is also predicated on the assumption that to feed a world, we have to feed them a Western diet on those seed oil crops and grain crops, which is, again, making people sick and leading to all these problems. And it's meat is not part of that consideration to your point. So I think to me, it almost feels like it's straight out of the commodification playbook. Like, hey, let's perpetuate the status quo. I'm one of these big food complexes that benefited from the Green Revolution. Like, what's better than perpetuating the status quo is expanding it and creating a myth that we have this obligation that doesn't exist, but that gets a lot of momentum behind my enterprise or my self promoting opportunity, becoming the cornerstone of feeding people that actually probably are just fine on their own and would prefer to continue to have their own sovereignty. And it just feels like this idea, like it's like, hey, we have to feed the world. So by any means necessary, let's figure out how to create a few crops, make them really cheap, ultra processed food, and let that be the system that feeds the world. And that is, to me, like, wait a minute, hold on a second. This is really fucked up. Somebody's manipulating our minds and getting in there and planting a seed as if it's a truth. And I think it's a fallacy with an agenda.
So if the crop production is like these limited number of commodity crops that are the Western civilization is kind of growing to feed a global population, what percent of the Earth's surface, like how much of our landmass is actually conducive for growing that, plant-based monoculture?
Is that a land use question?
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious. You're like, hey, this is how we're thinking about feeding the population with these crops, with these plants, but how much of the Earth's surface is actually going to be conducive for growing that?
As I understand it, a third of the Earth's agriculture land is suitable for growing crops. I think that's like 1.5 billion acres. Not that that's a big number. I don't think that resonates with anybody, but the rest is not capable. Of that third, 60 to 70% of the ag land is only suitable for grazing. And so let me put it differently. Around 30%, a little over 30% of the planet surface is considered arable, and only 3% of that is considered prime cropland. So again, let's just say a third of the world is suitable for agriculture. The majority of that is suitable for grazing. A very, very, very small percentage of that is prime cropland that can be row cropped like we've historically done and thought of.
So if you're saying 3% basically of our usable agricultural land mass is conducive for plant-based monocultures, and then when we're saying we're going to feed the world on 3% of the available land, that seems very uninclusive. Because what about like the Masai Mara of Kenya, or what are those handsome Argentinian cowboys called in Patagonia? I just want to say guanacos.
I know, but I think that's the llama.
That's the wild llama. Anyway, yeah, so there's these massive amounts of global populations that historically would not be feeding themselves because their land was not conducive for that plant-based or that single species of plant in an industrialized setting, yet we're forcing the globe to eat what we can only produce on 3% of the land.
Well, that's that substitution fallacy that, like, hey, we get rid of animals and we grow crops instead. And it's like, no, you can't grow crops where there's animals. In fact, you can raise animals where you grow crops, and we would say should, because that's plants and animals in harmony, but it doesn't work in reverse. You can't take range land and land that's not suitable for row crops where you can grow cattle and just manifest the ability to grow crops on it.
I'm always kind of reminded by look at your regional context. Like how did humans exist or sustain themselves on land? I don't know, even 150 years ago, 200 years ago, or before that. And that's like the regional wisdom, the productive capacity of that land. And so most of Texas, I think it's something like 70% of Texas is not conducive for what you would consider like crop production. And certainly where we are, in Fredericksburg, it's very semi-arid. And when I look around, I'm like, okay, the Comanche Indians survived on hunting. The pioneers survived on harvesting wild game and a little bit of foraging. And so the fact that there's people that are planting monocultures of row crops now in our community, that's certainly not what the architecture of nature wants to support, but it's perpetuated by government subsidies. So people continue to farm even though they're not successfully harvesting anything. And then one quick story to follow up on that. Katie and I saw this deer that was stuck in a fence like 4 or 5 years ago. And we stopped and we had some pliers in the truck, and we cut this deer loose, but it was in bad shape. And
it was hanging upside down by its leg that was wrapped around the barbed wire. It was wild.
Probably for like 2 or 3 nights.
Yeah.
I mean, horrible. This thing was like on its last leg, like figuratively, literally, it was going to die. So we cut it free. This deer gets up to run away, instantly collapses when it puts weight on that leg, tries again, collapses. Like we're just watching this thing. Its leg is dangling. The bone is absolutely broken. It's just like absolutely limp and flopping in the air. And turns out, 6 months later, that deer lost its leg. Now it has a stump, but it is thriving. I saw it last night driving into the ranch. I mean, this deer has had multiple fawns. It's reproduced. It's healthy. It has 3 legs. So I'm like, man, that is a resilient animal. That animal that is adapted to fit in the context of this region that's so hard is so impressive. And so when I think about that versus, okay, well, what would happen if I planted kale in my yard? It's like, if it didn't rain for a week, the kale would die. If it hailed, the kale would die. If we got like a blue
Cat
northern
shit in the garden.
Yes. If that hungry deer with 3 legs wanted to snack, that kale would die. And so it's just wild to me that we're even having this conversation when it's so abundantly clear that our ecoregion is not conducive to feeding people kale. And I'm just saying kale, but it could be any of your given monoculture plant-based commodity crops.
I think what's also interesting in that, to that point, is about what's appropriate and what's possible. We talked about how much land is available for agriculture and what aspects of it are suitable. What we didn't mention is that of that amount, a ton of it is degraded. Like a third of it is degraded. And I think, by some estimates, there's a huge chunk that's, beyond repair. A material chunk. And you talking about Texas and the US and where food comes from and so on. And I mentioned earlier how the disruptions that we've caused and damage we've done to our system is compromising the ability for the current system to produce food in the future. In the US alone, there's 3,100 counties. And in the last 2 years consecutively, 2,000 counties have declared disasters for drought. So it's like, again, these food systems are degraded and degrading further rapidly. We're losing topsoil, all the rest of this stuff. And so we talk about what is theoretically possible historically, that changes in the present and going forward because the system becomes less and less capable of even doing what it once was able to. And we get fewer and fewer options available to us unless we begin to try to heal those systems. And so Texas is a good example. I mean, I think every county, I'd have to go back and look, but I think almost every county in Texas was declared a disaster area for drought the last 2 years. And the numbers prior to the last 2 years aren't really any better.
Yeah. The way I would describe that, and this is probably illegal, so don't do this, especially if you live in the city, but I challenge you to maybe metaphorically shoot a bullet into the air. Don't actually shoot a bullet into the air. Watch that sucker go high up in the atmosphere and then eventually hit its peak height, and then it's going to drop. And it's just going to randomly drop. You're not controlling where it's going to drop, but it's going to hit somewhere in your area, probably within a mile radius. And where that hits, go out and find that spiritual bullet that's not real and draw a 1 by 1, kind of like a square foot of that land. And I guarantee you it's going to be degraded, to Robby's point, potentially even like 90% bare soil. And so that's like the reality of what global land looks like. Certainly grasslands have probably been hit the hardest. And so as far as, I mean, even right there, that being said, how do we feed a glowing population? Well, how about instead of having 90% bare soil, we have 50% bare soil, which, how long did it take us to get?
Or how about 0%?
How about 0%?
50 sounds pretty
Is that
pathetic.
doable? Some people say that's not doable.
0%? Who said that?
I don't know. Haters.
Robby, do you have a stat on that?
What have you seen? I mean, I don't want to be like, I know I exaggerate, but our ranch was very similar. 90% plus bare soil 7 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I was saying I want to get a Google image. I want some
LiDAR.
LiDAR. I want to get some LiDAR on the ranch. But I mean, if we're talking about global systems, I guess your whole point is that this is happening globally. Because one question that I had, I don't know why I'm looking at Robby. One question I had for Robby is like, are there any food systems in the world that aren't broken aside from regeneratively managed properties?
It's easy to say yes to that, but it's hard to.
But I mean, like, can we okay, so Taylor and I on the drive here this morning, we were talking about like the Earth as the globe. I don't know why I'm doing this. Some people don't think it's this shape.
Some people
think
like
it's like this. So I'm just gonna do it both ways. So the globe,
2D or 3D?
I'm doing it both.
Okay. Well, it wouldn't be a globe if it was a sheet of paper.
I'm inclusive to all.
You're not being inclusive by saying globe.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, so the world, is that a shape?
I think the globe works. I think we'll stick with the globe.
Okay, so globally, if we have a third of the globe is degraded, probably
70% of the dry regions are degraded.
Okay.
Which is where a lot of food comes from.
Which is where a lot of the food comes from. What we were talking about in the car this morning is if the world is a living, breathing system, and we focus a lot of our attention on the United States and like Fredericksburg in particular, like we care about our own ecoregions. But, our ecoregion is impacted by what's happening in the Amazon rainforest, for instance. And so we will acknowledge that global climate is impacted by regional systems. Where am I going with this?
Quantum physics?
No. No.
The butterfly effect?
AI?
Y'all.
No, that's really what you're talking about. I mean, the interconnectedness of everything.
The interconnectedness of it all. I don't know what my question was.
Okay.
Sorry.
It'll come back to you. You can interrupt.
Well, I think the one, like, while we're on the subject, I think going back to, go ahead.
It came to me. Okay, so we have a global system. We're all interconnected. So if we aren't addressing the global system, if we are only focusing on regenerating our local ecosystems, but not at a global scale, aren't we sort of doing ourselves a disservice by not acknowledging that this regenerative system, this regenerative process has to happen globally?
Yeah.
And in order for it to happen globally, we have to support the global efforts.
Before Robby gives a really smart answer,
okay,
I think what when I hear you say that, I envision like if a human being is sick, God forbid you go to a doctor, but if you go to a doctor, no offense, there's different types of doctors. If you go to a shaman, the doctor, if they're good, they're going to treat you as a whole organism. Right. You're not going to show up and say, my heart hurts. And they're going to say, all right, well, let's do like all these cardiac tests. Hopefully a good doctor will like look at you holistically. So that's what you're saying with the earth.
Yes.
We need to look and treat planet Earth holistically.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I mean, and I think relatable for most listeners, I think our atmospheric carbon issue isn't unique to Gillespie County.
Right.
And issues related to droughts and flood and toxins in waterways and oceans and losing 1% of insect species every year, and all of these things affect all of us. And so, yeah, this is 100% these are global crises driven by global practices and impacts that will require global solutions and collaborations. I mean, and that's a huge part of the reason why with Force of Nature, you look at what our founding principles have been, and it's, create a global regenerative supply network, support directly or indirectly the conversion of 1 billion acres of agriculture land to regenerative. There's not 1 billion acres of agriculture land in the U.S. There's a heck of a lot of agriculture that the U.S. relies on internationally and that international markets rely on also internationally. And so it's, how do we support correcting these challenges at scale? And the scale's global. Is that?
Yeah, that's totally what I was getting at. I just think it's really interesting when we think about our food system and the food that we consume. A lot of people assume that a lot of the food that they're consuming is coming from the United States, or the truth is, I feel like people don't really care where their food comes from. They don't really care where anything comes from.
Some people think that local is better than anything else.
That is true.
There is a local movement.
That is true. But I mean, when you dive into like, is local better? I'm like, I can't help but think of a guy that talked at our conference last year. And I remember his like main point was like, you support local above all else. And so if that means that you go and support your conventional farmer who's spraying glyphosate on his fields, you go support that guy and you eventually get him to transition. And I'm like, wait, so you're going to support the glyphosate world and you're going to consume herbicides and pesticides and these things in order to support a local system, as opposed to supporting like a regenerative system, maybe in the next state or maybe in the next country. It's just like, it's very odd.
Yeah.
Well, all else remaining equal, for sure. But that's reductionist. All else doesn't remain equal.
Right.
So, and by the way, like, we're not perfect and nobody's perfect. And so, I mean, I think it comes down to the consumer and their values. So which, you know, I think it's like for you to decide. You know, when we talk about, because like we're not anti-local, like you, more than a lot of people I know, are major supporters of local and keystone in your small community in a number of ways. Meanwhile, again, we have stuff in our pockets from Asia with materials mined in Africa and all the rest of the stuff that we know is a reality. And so, you know, and we even say like force of nature's third best place to get meat. Like go hunt it, suffer, struggle, form a relationship. Next best place, find a regenerative farm in your community, support them to the extent you're able, and then, you know, next best place at a scale solution. But yeah, like I also think, like, just to be really clear on what you said and what I was saying, I do think all else remaining equal local is better. Just understand that like there's nuance there, and go and meet them and explore them. Like, just don't expect perfection of them and support them as best you can to the extent it aligns with your values. And if it just simply doesn't align with your values, then there may be something on a slightly larger region. And what is local anyway? Is it a zip code? Is it a county? Is it a state? Is it a region? Is it a country? Is it a continent? So again, I think the nuance, the devil's in the details there, and the nuance matters. And
I'm suddenly curious, whose clothing is regenerative?
Oh.
Mine, you guys.
Was it locally
Why?
sourced?
No.
Is there any locally sourced regenerative
No.
shirts you can buy in Texas?
There's actually not.
mine's a local company, but it's
Is
not
it regenerative?
Oh,
See?
mine too. Mine's degenerative.
Degenerative.
We might be degenerating together.
But you have long sleeves, so you're more degenerative than I
Oh,
am.
shit.
Sorry, Robby.
Podcast over.
Cut off your sleeves immediately.
No, but I mean, like, again, like we're super conscious consumers, and clearly Katie just pulled out another great example of how it's really difficult to do. And so I think for us to tell people what to think and feel and how to purchase based on our values and ideas and beliefs is inappropriate. I think we can share what our values and ideas and beliefs are and offer encouragement and transparency. But to say that local is better in every instance is bullshit. To say that local isn't better in many instances is also bullshit, you know? And sorry, you did trigger me. Trigger warning. When you said that you don't think most people care. I disagree with that. I think most people for sure care. I think, you know, even if you look at testing data, which I know is your favorite sort of data to look at,
Love
consumer
market
research. Yep. I think over 70% of consumers say they care about something. The real question is like, to what extent are they willing to put forth effort to do something about it?
Yeah, like exactly. They might care, but then does that translate to a purchase or a decision or
A compromise or sacrifice?
A compromise or sacrifice.
And so I think like that's where brands and businesses that are driven by integrity come into play. And it's like, and it goes back to my point, I think, is like, hey, let's just try to create awareness to these issues and give them access to an opportunity that may be more approachable or more accessible to them to do something about it. Understanding that, you know, I don't want to say they don't care, and I don't want to call them lazy. Like, it really is hard. You know, there's probably a lot of things we could call each other out for being lazy when it comes to how much time and energy are you currently putting into that thing, which is technically relevant. But like, we're focused on the things that we're focused on, and life's hard and whatever. I don't want to make too many excuses for people, but you know, let's try to make it easier for them and give some grace.
Yeah. The farmers markets are a scene. And depending on your city or your community, they'll have different hype levels. Some farmers markets, people are like, these farmers are selling out in 10 minutes from when it opens. And then some people are just going there to socialize and
Like at our farmers
get
market.
drunk.
It's
Yeah.
the worst.
But I think local is for sure something that resonates with people, but there's definitely some compromises people are making. Or maybe they're not looking at their consumptive patterns holistically.
And again, nuance, right? Like, is it weird when you go to a market and you find like tropical fruit in your farmer's market, or you find people that like, hey, tell me the story of this animal. Did you raise it? How much land do you have? Whatever. Oh no, I didn't raise this one, and so on. So it's like, again, not to demonize or call anybody out, but like nuance, people.
You know what triggers
Details
me?
matter.
You know what triggers me with Katie's local statement is that, because Robby got to talk about how he was offended,
Victim.
is that bison, according to the USDA, like all these like food safety organizations that kind of regulate meat, they consider bison an exotic species. It's labeled as exotic
That
species.
is offensive.
Yeah, and it's the OG. It's the OG local. I'm like, if you really want to eat local, eat a freaking bison. Because beef cows are not indigenous to North America.
It is.
Neither are
Bison
sheep,
is the
neither are
only
goats.
native species that you will find in the grocery store.
So that's
Let's
how
just
you
be clear.
That's how you go ultra local. Local. Okay, let's get back on track.
Sorry.
Hang on.
Wait.
No, let's get back on track, but I'm going to go all the way back to where we tangented off from, and you're talking about where food comes from and the abilities of it and the international scale of it. But like one thing to point out in these degraded systems and in the current industrial system is that like when we've gone reductionist with our food production, we've, like the United States that produce a few grain type crops, we've stopped producing a bunch of other things. I think you started to get into land healing and like stocking rates going up, or the nutrition of the soil and the fertility of the soil improving, so yields improving. Like those things are true. What is also true is in regenerative systems, you tend to stack revenue or enterprises or products. So you're not just producing GMO corn and maybe throw in a crop of GMO soy in there, but you're producing region appropriate, land appropriate food. Maybe you go from 1 or 2 revenue streams to 5 to 10 revenue streams and plants and animals included in that. And so what you see, the reality that you see globally is these small farms outproduce both in calories and nutrition large farms. So I think you were trying to talk about, like, we talked about how much land is available, the earth isn't growing. We talked about that it's degrading. We talked about that it needs to improve. But not only do you improve, as you improve it, you get more of the same, but you get incremental on top of that by being able to add more things into it, again, that are appropriate for that region. And the last thing I'll say on this global thing is, like, I'm not going to be the person that tells people from Alaska they're not allowed to have bananas, just simply because it doesn't grow in their region. Or people that like Australian wine, that they can't have that here just because it comes from a different region.
Excellent point.
Mm-hmm. Or chocolate. Everybody likes chocolate.
I mean,
Chocolate doesn't grow here.
At the grocery store the other day, I was taking pictures of the origin of all of the produce that I was buying just so I could show it to you today, Robby. And I bought apples from New Zealand. What?
Yeah.
I mean, usually I don't look at country of origin when I'm like buying my produce at natural grocers.
You do look at how patriotic sounding the apple name is, though.
That is true.
Were those the
You should check it out.
Liberty apples, or
there's
what?
Liberty, there's Glory. There's been some good ones recently. Anyway.
Okay, so we recognize that the current prevailing food system is destructive. We cannot continue at the trajectory we're moving towards. Robby said racing off cliff. So what are the other alternatives? Like, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of focus around this. How are we going to feed a growing population? How are we going to continue to produce food in a way that we're not killing the earth, et cetera, et cetera? What are some of the solutions that are being proposed? And let's go like all the way just insane asylum, crazy people talk to like some real solutions. Maybe in that order.
I mean,
What's your
insane
craziest
asylum.
thing? Eating bugs?
I feel like, I mean, I wrote down Bill Gates when you said that because you have to bring Bill Gates up in every podcast that you do. But I feel like Bill Gates is on the forefront of this movement and controlling our food supply system.
I mean, he is the largest farmland owner in the United States now.
More than China?
I hope so.
Because at least he's American. So I would say, I know that he's, producing monocrops for his fake meat products and beyond. So that's number one.
So is that a solution though?
For him.
But is that a solution for the earth, for the population, for the betterment of humanity?
I mean, these are such leading questions. Of course not.
Well, I mean, explain yourself, because some people are going to be like, hell yeah, thank you, Bill Gates.
Thanks,
You're
Bill.
the man.
Hey, William.
Put one of those Beyond Meat Impossible Burgers right and just inject it in a sludge form.
Maybe can we back up one step and lay out a few solutions and then just rip them apart into tiny shreds, and then we can get to raw regenerative as best.
Yeah, let's put little. Yep, absolutely.
But I think Katie's point touches on a few of them, right? I think a lot of the solutions that get talked about loudly and are heard most are what I would consider to be doubling down on the status quo or perpetuating the status quo. So I think you hear, again, like feeding a growing population by any means necessary. Oh, industrial agriculture. Let's do more of this. Let's ignore the challenges and the consequences, and let's just push harder.
Let's rebrand it.
Yeah.
Rebrand it as plant-based.
Or then further, let's add a layer of complexity and inefficiency and cost and maybe wealth redistribution and relabel it as plant-based or lab-based technology solution. I think there are, on a spectrum, if those are on the far left, you start to get more towards the center, but still to the left of where I would say is ideal is things that are like improvements to the status quo, but are still reliant on it, So I think there's actually, and if you talk about like, hey, cold turkey changes don't work, we might get into that. Some of these things become interesting in building a bridge and spanning a transition period. But, there's some things coming out that are technology that are, hey, when we go spray into, instead of spraying indiscriminately all of the sides, can we target only using vision and cameras and AI and all of this stuff, like only weeds? And we can reduce application of herbicides to like 10% of what they were and run off of those herbicides to a fraction of that because it's targeted on the leaf of a thing. Okay, well, there's,
Have you seen the lasers?
Lasers to zap them?
Yes.
Yeah.
That shit is nuts.
Super Star Wars stuff. Like,
that is like, let's go put that on the list for the insane asylum shit.
So, I think, I don't know that I'm hearing, eliminate eating meat is certainly on the insane asylum side of like what you talk about for solving to feed a growing population. And then like Taylor said, I think maybe bugs fall in there.
I mean, a lot of the world eats bugs. So I don't.
It's true. I'm not hating on eating bugs per se. I'm hating on the industrialization of eating bugs.
Yeah,
it's the same as chicken.
It's a feedlot.
It's the exact
same. It's a feedlot for an insect.
I have a whole section on here on you can't feed a growing population on chicken.
Mm-hmm.
We can, but without jumping ahead, like you definitely can't do it with bugs, right? Like you can't. That would be an unnatural. Force our will, dominate, create imbalance in a system to do something that the system wasn't designed for. Again, humans didn't evolve chasing herds of grasshoppers to sustain themselves. I think there's a role in it, and there's a reality of it, and it's appropriate in certain instances, but not to feed the population. That's
I liked the picture that you painted, though, that it was actually happening outside. These things happen in warehouses and huge vats, and these grasshoppers never see the light of day.
All in synthetic. It's chicken. It's chicken.
Yeah.
Synthetic, modified, probably not really, wouldn't survive on their own in nature. Input driven, inputs coming from monocrop agriculture. It's just the exact, it's lipstick on a pig. It's rinse and repeat. It's deception and misleading.
Suffering of animals.
Yeah.
Sentient beings being tortured.
Absolutely. Ethical issues.
I always feel like when Scout puts bugs in a cup for studying purposes, that it's also animal mistreatment.
Yeah.
But anyway.
I think
if you were a vegan, you wouldn't care about that because the bugs don't matter. in your
That's true.
calculus.
That's true.
I could see myself eating bugs if I was starving.
Of course.
But here's the thing. If you eat a grasshopper and you don't roast it first, you're going to get
you
sick.
go bye-bye.
Yeah, that's like its defense mechanism. Did you know that? You have to cook it, crisp it up over an open fire.
This feels like an ad.
Yep.
There's not a I would love to eat. Whenever I have an option to eat bugs, I eat the bugs. I think it's fun and exciting and adventurous, but I'm not going to convert my food system and suggest that we should all be eating them at scale, because that is psychotic.
Okay, so where are we on
So
this?
do we have a good solution? Because I feel like these are so you're kind of like touching on perpetuating the existing system, rebranding it maybe for a little bit better, redistribution of wealth, using technology, doubling down on this like idea that somehow human ingenuity and creativity is greater than Mother Nature's capacity for creating a complex system, which is just mental disorder in itself. And then like eating bugs, that's not going to work. So like what's like these options suck.
Well,
They're
yeah,
set up to
and like
fail.
everything I laid out to your point, and I said it's perpetuation of the status quo, like plant-based, still relies on, monocrop, row crop. All the things we've laid out as problems with the industrial system really are still represented in that, plus new problems, energy efficiency, ultra processed, human health, etc. probably get worse. Same with the bugs. We'll throw chicken in there, and everything else, right? That's why I say, like slowing, right where if we're heading towards a cliff, slowing down doesn't do us a whole lot of good. And we could dive into and rip all of those things apart, but I just feel like it's easier just to say they all rely on the system that we've already explained is screwed up, and it turns out that the solution, which is where I think we're trying to get to those harms and damage caused by that system, is offered by the regenerative system. So not only does the regenerative system feed us better than the existing one, but it actually heals all those harms and then creates other abundant positive externalities. So it improves the functions of ecosystems, it improves habitat and diversity and all of the cycles of nature, from the water cycle to energy cycle, nutrient cycle, all the community dynamics. It creates more nutrition in our food. It introduces less toxic chemicals and unnatural things. It works within balance within the system and doesn't, dominate to the extent that the current industrial system does. It builds resiliency, security, and stability, and it offers hope. And the way we always explain that is, it replaces a vicious system with a virtuous one. Like the industrial system is vicious. It veils the truth and it produces an abundance of negative externalities that we're calling global crises. The regenerative systems also has externalities, but they're all positive. They are all worthy of celebration.
And we've heard this is why we're doing this podcast, because we chest bump, high five, celebrate everything you're talking about. But then when you're talking to someone and they're hearing this for the first time, they're like, I want to be so excited. However, it's not scalable. You can't feed a growing population. And so it goes back to this. And so I'm in alignment with you. I think this is the best opportunity for a system to co-create with Mother Nature, one that has all these tangential benefits, creating this virtuous cycle. But for people that aren't even maybe familiar with what a regenerative system looks like, so specifically regenerative agriculture, can you just kind of like paint a picture? And also, how do animals fit into that equation?
Who wants to take that one? Because they'll be more concise than me.
Oh.
That's so big.
Well, why don't you take it, Tay?
Katie's drawing snakes. I can't take my own
I was about
question.
to draw a mouse.
Yeah, it's not snakes if it's a mouse, Taylor. It's not even a reptile.
Okay.
Well, go ahead.
No, I mean, yeah, it's just for people that are like, well, what the hell? Like, what does this awesome regenerative system look like on the ground? What are like some of the components involved in this, and how do animals play a part?
It's so
big.
But I mean, you and I spoke for like an hour and 20 minutes on just the 6 principles of regenerative agriculture, and I think those 6 principles are a part of it. and there's so many more things. But I think like in its simplest form, right? Like instead of trying to work against the will of nature and dominate it, you're trying to work within. You're trying to take its wisdom and blueprints and leverage that for food production. It's an imperfect imitation, but it is one that is time tested and proven over billions of years of evolution. And I think some of the ways that you would see that, and again, none of this is absolute and it's context based, but a system that requires massive external inputs, whether that be fertilizer, herbicide, fungicide, pesticide, petroleum, that creates a lot of that produces a product that isn't even remotely native or consistent with something that would be native in a region, like our plant-based systems, that requires disruption mechanically through tilling and or leveling rainforests or leveling forests or damming rivers. That is like the backbone of the current industrial system. And I would even go as far as to say the current industrial system has removed labor and people and human and the soul from that equation, the soul of food production, and replaced it with big business. Again, like we always say, we traded out agriculture for agribusiness. That's profit centric, and the result has been losing the things that the humans care about the most. Is that short and simple enough to take a 5-hour long conversation into 2 minutes?
Yeah, I'm sure this will provoke something from you guys, but like the way that I think about animals is fitting into this, I'm going to just like look back 200, 300 years ago to the context of North America. And it's like what some of the early European explorers witnessed, what a lot of the indigenous tribes experienced was the American Serengeti. So like an abundance beyond anything that we could ever comprehend today. I mean, we're talking like 40 million bison, 20 million pronghorn, 20 million elk, like millions of wild horses, hundreds of thousands of wolves, hundreds of thousands of grizzly bears, all co-creating something that you would liken to like the African Serengeti, but potentially more diverse, more abundant, and more beautiful. And so, like when you look back at how the architecture of nature existed, these animals, they weren't just there extracting from the land. It was that symbiotic relationship with our landscape. Robby, you talk about keystone species with bison, but a lot of these are keystone species in that which their presence on the landscape lifted up, elevated the entire energetic state of that landmass. Like the whole, some of the whole was greater than the unique parts. And so I just feel it's crazy that we recognize that these animals, like we vilified them for so long. However, like, isn't that just like such an insult to a creator or this entity that designed these perfect regenerative beings beyond anything that humans could ever fathom or come up with or try to reproduce with technology? So we have these regenerative beings, and now we're just telling everyone they're bad for your health, or they're bad for the land, or we shouldn't be eating them. That's just absolutely separation of human to nature, in my opinion.
For sure.
Yeah, I don't know. Amen, brother. And that's only the last 10,000 years that you just highlighted. You go back prior to that, and it's the same thing with different names and animals, but it's always animals. Again, we always say like nowhere in nature does a monoculture exist. It's always plants and animals. It's always bugs, harmony, soil, all of these things sustaining life. And it's only since the agriculture revolution and since the green revolution that we have so much of the Earth's surface desertified and existing in a monoculture of one species, where so much energy and effort is put into nuking any other form of life and calling it a pest or a weed or any other, derogatory term towards biology that's there to support a healthy system.
So I guess the biggest criticism specifically to animals, people are going to listen to this, and I think our audience is for sure more enlightened, Katie pointed out. But if someone, forwards this to their 70-year-old, or no offense to a 70-year-old,
I know.
like a parent, a less progressive human being who's more just drinking in the narrative of mainstream media saying animals are terrible and we need to eat more sludge, they're going to get this. It's going to like resonate somehow cellularly with them. I think that it's going to like, at least at the very minimum, stimulate some curiosity, but they're going to go to this default mode where, they're going to say like, well, what about greenhouse gas emissions and livestock?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this entire conversation is focused around monocrop production, and we haven't really discussed the impact of feedlots. And I mean, like, we are not advocating for feedlots for sure. I think that all the bad rap that livestock get is from studies around feedlot production systems, which is just a part of the industrial food production system. Like all the methane production research comes out of feedlots, and it neglects to look at an ecosystem that's actually fully functioning, where you have methanotrophic bacteria that consumes the methane and puts it back into the soil. And so there's so much there. I don't know where you want to touch on.
I mean, how about, should we be concerned about the greenhouse gas emission of animals?
No.
Absolutely not.
Well, otherwise, I think every other mainstream media outlet disagrees with that. So explain your position, sir and ma'am.
Ma'am. Go ahead.
I think there's a number of myths. I think the most popular one is carbon. And in this case, with meat, you're talking about enteric emissions, or belching methane. It's a byproduct of decomposition, which happens in the rumen of these ruminants, like the bison and the pronghorn and the elk and the whitetail and those animals that you just kind of laid out. Also have been producing through the millennia, and the land and the environment and the world has evolved to handle. I think. For clarification, the greenhouse gases that get talked about the most: carbon dioxide, methane, and I think nitrous oxide. You hear more about carbon dioxide and methane. Carbon dioxide exists in the atmosphere for about 1,000 years for all intents and purposes, and methane exists in the atmosphere for about 10 years. Methane's way worse than carbon dioxide, to be clear. From a greenhouse gas, from the challenge that greenhouse gases cause perspective. But you got to look at methane from animals as actually part of, again, like we just said, a natural process, biogenic methane, meaning it's been around forever. It's part of the system. It has been, as long as there are a consistent number of ruminants on the earth. It means there's a consistent amount of methane going up, a consistent amount of methane coming down, and it's in a state of homeostasis, and it's not a problem. In fact, it is a necessary reality and part of the balance. So reductionist thinking says, oh my gosh, methane's worse than carbon dioxide. Cows are terrible because they burp. And it's like, well, that's you're missing all of the points I just made, that it doesn't last as long, that the population of animals on the planet is consistent with what it's always been, that it's not. And in fact, there is methane increasing as a portion of the atmosphere. And the number one source of that is rice farming.
I did not know such things.
The next biggest source of it is, I believe, waste, trash waste, human waste, which ironically is the breakdown of food, which human waste is about 20% food. So we should probably talk about at some point the fact that we throw away almost as much food as we consume when it comes to feeding the world. But yeah, methane, if methane is an issue, it's not because of cows.
I just looked something up to I guess get a more holistic picture of greenhouse gas emissions, methane, et cetera, and says here we go. The EPA says that livestock only represent 3.9% of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions.
2% globally.
Yes. The number one, this shouldn't be a surprise. I'm actually going to pop quiz y'all. The number one sector, it's not food related, I'll give you that clue, that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions? What do you think it would be?
Transportation.
Travel.
I'll take both of those. Yes, 28.5%. But there's a second next one, 28.4%. Kind of related to travel.
Burning of fossils.
Electricity
Oh,
production, which, could be burning.
which I guess could be that.
Could be powering your Prius.
Could be powering your Prius.
So like, why are we focusing so hard on agriculture, specifically animal-based agriculture?
But not making everyday life choices that are actually significantly more impactful.
That's demented.
Well, and again, that 2% globally or 3.5% domestically is still biogenic methane. It's coming down as fast. It's homeostasis. It's not incremental. It's not causing incremental harm to the system. In fact, it's been around longer than we have. And I had a second point there. Darn it. And then just a reminder that a third of the legacy load of the carbon in the atmosphere, which is incremental, has come from tilling the ground, oxidizing carbon-based life and putting gas into the environment, which does go back to those plant-based systems, not the animal-based systems. Although a significant portion of plant-based agriculture goes to feeding animals in feedlots. It's not as much as you think, but it's a significant portion, which is why we don't support the feedlot model or grain feeding or supplementation of animals.
All right, so I don't want to get us down what has been dubbed the carbon tunnel vision. This like reductionist idea that we should only be focusing on carbon. There's other criticisms with meat production. I don't want to spend too much time on it. This is about feeding a growing population, but I think this is something we need to cover because this is what the skeptics are going to come back with when we're having this conversation. So maybe, Robby, could you just quickly kind of talk through some of those misconceptions, or actually, I would say that it's more pernicious than a misconception. I would say some of the lies that we were being told about meat production.
Yeah, I think we could talk forever on all these. We went a little deeper into emissions, but I think like check the box, the emission issues on cattle is bullshit. We talked about this myth or lie that, not only do they cause all these problems, we should just stop raising animals and raise and grow plants where animals are currently. Like, that's bullshit, not possible. We already went through that.
Hold on. We got to stop calling it bullshit because bullshit's really...
Oh, yeah. It's super nourishing.
Manure from a bull is badass.
Yeah.
So, what could we call it? Fucking...
Evil lies. It's an evil lie. It's an evil lie.
Okay, fair enough. I was going to call it a bear claw.
Yeah. So cattle don't compete
remember bear claws?
Yeah. Was that the gas station?
Yeah, gas station bear claw, not a real bear claw.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I think the other one that you hear a lot, and there's been some provocative articles, like it takes an Olympic pool of water to make a hamburger. I don't know what they are. I made that up. It's some fabricated, sensational bullshit like that. But water, it takes a lot of water to... fabricated bear claw. Again, that one's about as much of a joke as the emissions argument. Somewhere between 92 and 98% of the water attributed to raising, beef cattle is water that has fallen from the sky and irrigated land with natural land with natural growing plants on it. To assign that, to say that it's inefficient is ridiculous. And further, any water that is drawn by cattle from a waterway or an aquifer is then cycled into the system and redistributed across the land, which actually is a benefit to the land. So again, water is total bullshit. Also, rice takes twice as much water. A pound of rice takes twice as much water as a pound of beef. Globally, 30% of groundwater is for rice, 12% is for wheat, and so on and so forth. So water, absolute evil eye, bear claw when it comes to beef. And then I think the other big thing I hear, and tell me if there's anything I'm missing, is, okay, fine, you're right. Regenerative is way better, but here's my final gotcha. There's just not the land to support it. It can't, scale. Take economics and distribution and supply chains aside. There's just not a land base available to convert to that system that can feed the world.
Yeah, you're right. That's a huge one.
And I feel like that one's more, I think that one touches on plants and row crops, but it also, it touches a lot on meat. And so from like the from the crop perspective, which I think we're all probably getting tired of talking about, but it's also like, again, there's this whole plant versus animal thing that we have to address. And so the conversation's tilted towards plants get a free pass. And I think we're not trying to say plants are evil. We're just saying they shouldn't get a free pass. They have a lot of issues that we should be honest about and factor into our conversations and our solutions. But all plant-based systems can be improved, through regenerative practices, cover cropping, limiting tilling, practicing the principles of soil health, and integrating animals. And animals are an interesting one. So, I think let's just say, like, if we were going to take the U.S. population and take the beef that we produce, and could that convert to regenerative? In the U.S., we currently raise and finish about 29 million head of cattle, depending on what year you look it up. And it's estimated that it takes 1 to 2 acres to raise, any one head of animal. So that'll be the foundation for some of the math. Again, it varies. It's on a spectrum. But let's just talk about, like, is the land available to take what we're currently doing and convert it over? There's something like 90 plus, almost 100 million acres planted for corn. And a bunch of that goes to feed livestock. So if we just take the land that's raising row crops specific to feeding livestock, and we take a small portion of it and finish livestock on it, we can cover a huge gap. I think I need to give me a pause here. I'm not saying that really well, and I need to.
I mean, even just the whole idea that if we look at most land and globally, it's so degraded that there could be like 90% bare soil. So if we want to grass finish or raise twice as many animals to feed more people, then it's not as simple as like we need to go colonize Mars and plant pastures on Mars. We literally need to
improve the land that we currently have.
Yeah, the productivity of the land that we have by 2x minimum, which I would argue you could do in a single growing season if you look into the principles of nature and those soil health concepts. Did that stimulate your brain?
I'm sorry, take 1 second.
Morgan, can you make a note of this? Thank you.
Okay, sorry, tell you what was the...
We were talking about there's not enough land.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, and then I was killing you some time, and I was just saying that if we just double our land production in this country, then we can double as many animals as we carry.
Productivity? Yeah, I got that.
And then I thought maybe your brain would have jump-started. That little blood clot would have moved.
Most of this stuff, I wrote the notes and I just remembered. And then I got to this section and I stopped remembering. So I actually had to look at the notes, and there's more notes here. So I just wanted to read through them.
Yeah.
So I'm probably going to start that section over at that, because I misrepresented that 29 million number.
Yeah, that was crazy. What is that? I thought I was going to talk about that.
Well, we actually kill like 40 million head, to my knowledge. I think 39 or 29 million of them are finished in feedlots.
Okay.
Damn.
So if I can...
Yeah, magic.
So like in the U.S., best I understand it, we slaughter around 40 million head of cattle a year. 29 million of those tend to be finished in feedlots. So it's the overwhelming majority. The rest are finished on grass and in pasture. I think it's important to note too that the majority of beef spends the majority of its life in pasture until it goes to a feedlot for the final step. And that's where it's in the feedlots where it really gets, heavy supplementation of grains and stuff. But okay, back to the 29 million cattle finished in feedlots. That would be what we would need to figure out how to finish on pasture and grass in the United States. And if we assume, 1 to 2 acres per head needed to finish them, we can start to do some math based off of acreage available. If we take the 90 to 100 million acres of corn that's planted in the United States, recognizing that a huge chunk of that is only planted to feed livestock, and the remaining chunk of that, like 40% goes to livestock and the rest goes to high fructose corn syrup and ethanol. I don't think we're not eating a lot of that. So it's not like substituting food for food. It's substituting bear claw for food. But if we only, take 15 million acres of that, we can literally finish half of those animals that are in feedlots currently on that land. And we could even produce more food, right? Because we talked about stacking enterprises and not just finishing animals on it, but creating other food. And so there's this abundance. There's also, just in the US alone, again, 500 million acres privately owned. That's pasture land suitable for raising livestock, but it's being underutilized at like only a third. So if we just took another 5% of that, it more than makes up for all the land that we would need to finish all of the animals currently in feedlots on grass and pasture systems. And it doesn't account for the other opportunities to go above and beyond that. Because I would say, we're eating 86% or 84% of the beef we were eating a generation ago. We should be eating like 150%. Like we need to be eating more meat, not less. And so we're going to need more land. And also grass-finished animals are slightly smaller because they don't have as much fat, maybe 20 to 30% less. So we're going to need to finish a few more of them. And so let's just, not just make it even. Let's just really stack the deck in our favor. There's another 20 million acres in reserve programs where farmers get paid by the government to leave fields fallow and not produce any kind of food on it. That's not good for the land to not have biology happening and ecosystem services happening. And so there's an opportunity to improve that land, not by leaving it necessarily fallow, but by allowing it to improve and regenerate through regenerative practices. So there you go, another probably 10 million head at 2 acres a head. And then again, that doesn't even account for the fact that when you begin to improve your management practices and regenerate land, your stocking rates go up. So all of a sudden, what was 2 acres to finish an animal becomes 1 acre. And I think there's research out there that shows stocking rates can go up by 30 to 100% when practicing regenerative agriculture. And let's be clear that it takes time and it's context-based. Some places can do it quickly. Some places it might take 5 to 10 years. But we get more productive in addition to getting more food. So like, is the land available? There's so much abundance of available land and opportunity. And what I said wasn't about converting all of those things. It was taking fractions of what's available and beginning to make it more productive for the raising of livestock and producing food. And then there is all of the other stuff like improving the way we practice regenerative on row crop and creating more food per acre and more nutrition within that food, because again, we're harming people with the current lack of nutrition in our food that our current system is failing us for.
So hypothetically speaking, it sounds like we have a really big opportunity to transition existing land, shifting our mindset to moving towards this regenerative system and having a tremendous carrying capacity improvement, but also nourishing people rather than just filling their bellies with empty calories. So like moving from this hypothetical transition, I've heard critics, skeptics point to like this story about Sri Lanka, as being this example of a nation that, pulled the plug on chemical agriculture, that relied on the importation of fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. And when they did that, the entire economy, an agricultural economy, collapsed. Farmers went out of business. Production rates went down like up to 60%, 60% lower yields. Obviously like suicide rates went sky high. The country actually had to import food for the first time in a long time. And so there's like this cautionary tale where it's like, if we change the system, if we move away from this conventional industrial system, what if Sri Lanka repeats itself? So I'd just be curious if what went wrong there?
And is there to glare at the camera?
Is there a better example?
Oh man, so much went wrong there. Well, let's clarify a couple of things too. Like one, Sri Lanka specifically went organic, and basically said overnight, stop importing some of the fertilizers and sides, and you can't spray it. So like everything we've been talking about and are promoting is regenerative. Organic is not regenerative. Regenerative, unlike organic, introduces a lot of practices intended to heal and improve and restore resiliency, and organic largely limits the applications of some of these sprays. And then in the case of Sri Lanka, they just mandated it all of a sudden. And so you went from a system that has been degraded and destroyed and disrupted, so it became reliant on these chemical amendments, and then they removed that very tool. And it's like, we're talking about biology here. To me, this is like, anybody that's ever known anybody dealing with substance abuse, you can't always quit cold turkey, or it can literally, like, even just stopping drinking for an alcoholic will kill you if there's not a transition that is smooth and guided. And I think maybe you guys even anecdotally can speak firsthand, like what you experienced, and maybe a similar effort to rip the Band-Aid off too quickly and not recognizing how degraded the land was and that it wasn't ready, and there needed to be a smoother transition.
Yeah, I like the alcoholism thing. I always think about it as like when we ripped the cord, pulled the plug, made that immediate shift and transition from at our ranch, a system that was dependent on the chemical inputs, and then we removed that from the system. The biology was not present. The biology was exhausted. It couldn't do the work. And so the way I always thought about it's like you had this sedentary child playing video games all day long, eating Hot Pockets. And then one day his mother was like, get your ass off the couch and run a marathon. And like, what would happen? That's basically what we did to our land. We asked it to run a marathon when it had been just crunching Cheetos and getting thick in the wrong juicy ways. And so I think that system, it doesn't work. And in retrospect, we should have gradually reduced our inputs, I think, to have the most success. But it was a shock for us because when we removed those inputs, nothing happened. Literally, you remember? The grass did not grow a millimeter.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the same thing as when we were talking about stocking rates. It'd be like, oh, okay, well, I'm regenerative now. And so, I changed my mind. So I'm going to put twice as many animals on my land and just assume everything's going to fall into place. No, it doesn't work like that. There's a process. The conditions have to be right. And practicing these things helps improve the conditions over time, but you still have other things you're not even in control of, like weather and, so many other things that require just a little bit of patience and reality. And I think that's where some of those technological solutions, like, hey, is there a way to spray less and be more targeted with it or whatever, can help support a transition. They're not a destination. They're not a long-term solution, but they might be part of the protocol to get you from where you are to where you need to go. But there's a million examples that we could elaborate on that say, like, you can't just go cold turkey like that in so many instances. And this is one of those.
So is there an example of a large transition that's occurred? So, I mean, it doesn't have to be in the US, but globally, somewhere where there was a successful transition from that chemical input system to a better, more virtuous system, whether it be organic or regenerative.
Maybe within the force of nature supply chain. Do you have an example of that? Because I feel like we've done quite a bit of transitioning.
The Sri Lanka example specifically is talking about transitioning cropland.
Right.
Where it's so dependent on inputs. And then suddenly you're moving, like you've created a dependency and an addiction. You got to be more thoughtful about how you make the transition. From a force of nature example perspective, we're dealing with animals and meat, and so there are a lot of examples, but we don't have the same. Again, we can't. Our example would be if we would have tried, like, what wouldn't have worked is if we would have just tried to throw double the animals out there, which I kind of touched on a second ago. But there's a ton of examples of places that we've worked with managing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres. We've seen this happen with partners that we have in the US, and we've seen this happen with partners that we have internationally, where they've been able to change their practices and begin pursuing a regenerative path and seeing tons of positive benefits from it. And so I think, like, in the US examples, we've been working longer. We only started, like, with rumen, well, in the U.S. examples, like we've seen partners that are, I got to be careful because not every partner wants us to talk about them and name them. And so I got to be thoughtful about what I say, but it's really cool and exciting stuff that I want to share. So, we have partners that have a number of ranches that span many dozens to many hundreds of thousands of acres that, actually had doing really incredible things, but still we're finishing, animals in on a grain-based confinement system, and have been able to close down the majority of those systems and convert the majority of their supply to pasture finishing and grass finishing. Huge partners and huge volumes within that industry, but like we've been able to make that transition at scale successfully, and then the results haven't just been like we can do it and produce the meat. The results have been they're less reliant on external inputs. Their land is benefiting from it. Bird species, you guys alone, right? Like your bird counts and your biomass and the stories that you have about improving water cycle at Rome Ranch. You're a smaller footprint, but we see similar exciting and profound benefits on larger footprints and all over.
Do you believe it?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds too good to be true.
It's not.
These are examples of force of nature driving massive, large-scale change too. But I always go back to just like that Northeast province or that state in India as a really good example. They decided they were going to transition their whole industrial chemical-based agricultural system to an organic system. And so we're not talking like small scale. This is 66,000 farms in India. This entire region made the transition, and it didn't happen overnight. I think it happened in like 10 years. And what occurred was the government slowly weaned off the subsidies of the inputs for the fertilizers. So every year, something like it got 10% closer to the actual cost of the fertilizer that farmers had to pay. Governments put in place these educational centers that taught farmers how to compost, how to cycle manure as nutrients. The colleges in India started teaching organic agriculture. And then you had this shift over 10 years where they completely weaned themselves off. And now that entire state, it's outlawed, it's banned to import any kind of nutrient for plant production. So that's phenomenal.
That's cool.
I think that the story that we're telling is that it takes time, and that's contextual, that's regional, and again, that's just like that's just cooperating with Mother Nature.
Yeah, and not to get confusing, but the example you just described exceeds the standard for organic as it is legally defined here in the United States. Which it leans more towards regenerative than organic, and those are different things.
Yep.
But the points are all the same.
So I guess this isn't just hypothetical, but we're giving actual examples. Sorry, I'm not very good at multitasking.
I can tell.
Do you need a pee?
Time cut.
20 minutes?
I just am trying to figure out what we're trying to accomplish within the next.
I got food waste.
Yeah, that was going to be food waste. And then do you want to recap and just make it crystal clear? I also had like, what is our limiting factor necessary to transition to regenerative? But we're kind of a little bit talking about that.
What was the last point?
Maybe we should just talk on, I'm going to just talk on really quick. Well, let's just do what's our limiting factor and why we're not transitioning more globally to regenerative. And then let's talk about food waste.
Robby, I feel like you are
And then a recap.
intentionally not addressing the international thing. I feel like I brought it up like 3 or 4 times for you to just like fucking nail it. And you're just like,
well, we've only been working on like the Australia thing, like converted that land, but I can't tell you, like they haven't, like their savory follow-up is like in the next couple months.
Yeah.
No, it's like in the next couple months.
Mm.
So like I can't tell you what has happened. I can say like, hey, we converted it to regenerative, but that question was like, can you give me examples of how it's continuing to produce food. Now, what's cool is like we just had our LSI with them yesterday, and they're like training all their managers on some of this stuff now and expand. Anyway, but
Okay.
sorry.
Okay.
Maybe and then as a recap or something.
Did you want to talk nutrition? Anybody? That was the only other thing.
Golly, if we can do it quick. You want to do it quick?
I think Katie was the one who said we should talk about it. I thought maybe.
Oh, I just thought that was an interesting fact. It's pretty repulsive, to be honest.
Well,
but
maybe that's in the recap too. It's like population's growing less, population's getting sicker, younger. We have more issues with obesity than we do, and nutritional deficiency than we do with.
I think
starvation.
obesity is a nutritional deficiency.
Okay.
Yeah.
Technically.
Okay, let's just
both.
We'll get through this really quick. This next thing is just quick. We'll go, why aren't we transitioning more land, talk about food waste, and then recap where we can talk about nutrition.
Okay.
I had a really good thought for the rate limiting factor. Now I don't remember what it was.
Oh, well, shit. Maybe, Katie, can you just say something about mindset and then just riff on that, and then Robby will maybe it'll come to him.
Can I ask the question and then you talk about mindset?
Babe, god dang it.
It's just the worst when somebody's like, talk about this thing that you...
Well, if there's something else you want to talk about, I thought you'd want to talk about that. Whatever. You want to ask her or you want me to ask you?
I'll ask it.
Okay, go.
What's the
And
question?
Go. Well, we're talking about like, this works. There's examples of it working, but why is it, what's the limiting factor to like scale? I don't want to say scaling, but transitioning more land.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the biggest questions I have, or that I would assume that people listening would have, is like, well, if there's clear evidence that this is better, it's better for the animals, better for the land, better for everything, why are more people not doing it? Like, what's stopping people from transitioning aside from that's going to take longer to be successful at it?
Yeah, I think that's a complex question with a lot of unique variables that just, like are so specific to different families, different regions. But ultimately, if I really try to just break this down to what is the biggest limitation in regenerative supply chains growing, more people transitioning, it's really just, it needs to be a shift, not in, like the question isn't like, how much land do we have? We already addressed that. We have enough land. It's not like, is this better for all the stakeholders? We've already addressed that. But really what has to happen, it's the human mindset needs to shift. That's the last, but also the greatest obstacle, the greatest barrier to overcome is how we think, and to take a moment to step back, to look at ourselves in the mirror, to question our own beliefs, to question what we have been taught, to question what we have been doing our whole lives, and have that opportunity, that moment for rebirth, and to think about doing things differently. I feel like that's the biggest struggle and the challenge that we're facing.
Yeah.
I actually totally agree with that. I think you covered that was like a really broad, and it covered a lot. But I think you touched on it when you said what we've been conditioned to believe, and we have to have the opportunity. Like, I think people are being lied to and misled. I think there's a lot of myths and lies being promoted at massive scale that are causing people to be confused. I think there's a lot of, in fact, not a lot of, the overwhelming majority of lobby dollars that goes to regulation, that goes to policy, that leads to and is a key driver for the existing food system, has a vested interest in the status quo, and it makes it, everything you just said needs to happen, but it's really difficult for that to happen if conversations aren't allowed, or are silenced, or there's noise thrown out to confuse and mislead and misdirect. And so, I think that at some point we need our captured system to start representing our best interests and the desires and the will of the people, so that everything you just laid out can happen.
I don't want to skip over this point because I think it's so important, because we're talking about, like, again, how do you feed a growing population? And I don't think we're being true to ourselves or being accountable if we don't touch on food waste as a significant topic. So,
I don't know. When I think about food waste, I think about, like, the typical person putting something in the refrigerator, going mold. And when I say the typical, I think about our family, honestly. Like the strawberries sitting in the refrigerator for too long and then getting moldy and you just have to put them in the compost pile or whatever. But I don't know if I guess there's a differentiation between food that goes into a compost pile and is recycling back into a nutrient cycle versus food.
I wouldn't call that food waste.
That's not food waste to me. I mean, it's
upcycling.
Yeah, it's an additional expense at the grocery store. But I guess food waste would be like throwing it in the trash and it being stuck in a plastic bag, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or not, and then it produces methane.
Or not, yeah.
And then historically, how would that have looked? There would have been less waste because there. I think the U.S. is the worst offender in food waste. I think we've, again, through commodification, cheapened our food to the extent where people don't see the value that it represents, and it's easy to discard it and take it for granted and be wasteful with it.
Well, there is an excess surplus of food in the United States.
There's an excess surplus. I mean, we produce 1.5 times the amount of food globally than we need. Globally, there's an excess of food. U.S. has the most excess and the most waste. And we also in the U.S. used to be, what do we always say? Founding fathers, majority, and then 60% farmers a century later, and then 30% a century later, and then single digits now. We would have been, and we wouldn't have been growing one thing. We would have been having a almost a closed loop system, multi-species growing plants and animals, and we wouldn't be just taking our scraps and composting them. We'd be feeding chickens and feeding pigs and monogastrics, and we'd be recycling and upcycling that waste. But just for the scale and for the conversation at hand, most of the food comes from row crop systems or is supported by row crop systems. Upwards of 30 to 40% of crops are lost before harvest. Yeah. So there's a huge amount of waste there in a system that stat doesn't exist with meat. We don't lose that many before harvest, not to mention we don't require all those inputs and all the rest of the stuff and inefficiencies. And then another quarter is lost due to waste. So more than half the food we grow doesn't feed anyone. And then that quarter that goes to waste, again, is generally going into landfills and causing its own set of negative externalities and problems. Fortunately, thank God, meat food waste tends to be lower. It's only 20%. Only. It's like only 20% of like the sentient lives that we should respect and pay homage to and show reverence for gets thrown into a garbage can. It's a terrible reality. It's too much. And if you look at kind of going back to what we were talking about, like the growing population, I said, it grew like, I think something like 1% or 2% a year since like 1950s. And so we went from 2 billion to 8 billion people. It's only projected to grow 0.1% a year going forward, and then plateau and maybe even decline outside of Africa. And so the reality is, how much more food do we need to produce today for a 25% increase in population? Well, if we're already growing 150% of the food we need, probably already have enough to support a 25% increase in the population. And like Taylor said, there's other things that we can do from a mindset perspective and so on to shift our attitudes towards being wasteful with food. But there are still things that we can do to be more productive and produce even more food than we currently are. If we truly needed it, our food systems have so much more potential than they're being leveraged for. And, what is feeding? I think we have a misconception around what it is to eat. Are we just like trying to fill our bellies with empty calories that cause us harm? Or are we trying to nourish the population? Because the population as it stands today, and similarly the population that is growing, is really sick. And when we started this green revolution, feed a growing population battle cry, famine was an issue. Kind of touched on that a little bit. I question the degree to which it was an issue at that time, but it was an issue. Now it's reversed. Famine's not just the issue, but obesity is the issue, and simultaneous to obesity and all of the health consequences of that, we have massive nutritional deficiency. So the food that the system is producing is failing the population. So we have to see some changes. I don't think that we need to find a way to like this idea of like feeding a growing population, like, oh my God, we have to quadruple our output of food or we're all, going to die. It's like, no, we don't have to really add that much more output. We just need to create a better output with what we have, and more can come as a result of that.
The whole idea of there being more overweight people in the world, so more people with obesity than starvation, is mind-blowing, because that's not what you maybe think about. The interesting juxtaposition is that a long time ago, it used to be a sign of status and wealth to be overweight. You guys remember that? Like all the kings and queens. You guys remember that back in the day?
Yeah.
And now it's like the opposite, where it's the people who are in the greatest amount of poverty, who have the lowest amount of resources. Those tend to be the communities that are the most overweight. And so again, it's like, what quality of food are they getting?
Yeah, to be clear too, population growth is coming from developing countries, and 2/3 of the population in developing countries are obese. It's like 600 million people globally, which is the facts behind the point that you just made.
Okay, so if we can just break this down, like as simple as you can, or not. I don't care if it's simple, but like just go back to this original premise, this original question, this curiosity that created this conversation, which is, just want to give each of you an opportunity to kind of bring it home. So, Robby, can we feed a growing population with meat or with a regenerative system?
The one-word answer is yes.
It's pretty simple.
Do I have permission for more?
Yeah.
Are we recapping, or are we just
recapping?
Confirming?
Yes. And anything that I feel like is just speaking to you that you need to reemphasize, really want to leave listeners with.
Yeah, I think you nailed it a moment ago about mindset. I think we need to question and challenge what we're being told are facts, and understand and appreciate that reductionism has a lot of faults and the nuance matters. The population's growing, not in the need to feed that population isn't as it's presented. How we're currently feeding the world is failing. It's failing the population. It's not sustainable. It won't be able to feed the existing population, let alone a growing one. And if we continue down this path, we're going to be going. The population will certainly not be growing. It will be declining because of famine and starvation. So there has to be an alternative that not only feeds the existing population but nourishes it, and can feed any potential growth in that population. And the only viable long-term alternative to that is regenerative, because it is a system that heals all the damage done by the status quo, and thus allows us to produce food, and that solves the reality that we're actually nourishing the population in the process of giving them calories and healing them.
My turn?
Yeah, unless you want to kill more time and I can go.
No, I mean, I can't emphasize as much as what Robby said. I feel like one of the most important parts of this is just that it has to happen at a global scale, like that we can't feed a growing population from within the United States. I'm sure we could, and I'm sure that's what we've been doing. But I don't think it's the responsibility of one country to be feeding the entire world. I think that we have a sick world. Like, our world is sick. Like, our land is degraded. Every single country needs to be contributing to a more regenerative system in order for it to actually function like an ecosystem, because the world is its own ecosystem.
I love it. My parting message would be that meat is not the villain. It should have never been the villain. It's been vilified, but separating ourselves from nature. That's really, I think, where we went wrong as a civilization, to believe that we could use our intelligence to create something better than the design of nature. And so with that, like, go kiss a cow, go love on a goat, go pet a sheep, don't milk a bison, but really show reverence and respect and honor for these sentient, regenerative beings that are more complex than us with our simple one-chambered stomachs. They have 4 stomachs. That's amazing. So we're like somewhere between a goat and a amoeba as far as the complexity of our digestive system. Just really like sit back and be in awe of that. And then What else? I would also say if people could stop questioning, stop saying this idea of eating less meat. Should we be eating less meat to save the planet, to grow population? What if we just reframe the whole question? I think back to your original idea, like should we be consuming as much industrialized processed grains and monocultures to save the world and to feed a growing population? Because if we really just restructure the question, at least you can kind of ponder at the first part. But the second part, once you are connected with the land, you're like, hell no. We cannot feed a growing civilization. We cannot save the planet with doubling down on industrial plant-based agriculture.
Or at least we should not be.
Yeah, not only are cows not the problem, but we should be eating more cows. Like Chick-fil-A got it wrong. Eat more beef. Totally eat more beef.
Eat more chicken. That's what Chick-fil-A said.
I know they got it wrong.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. They eat way less chicken and pay more for it. And then you inspired me to add that carbon is not the villain either. Carbon's not our enemy. Everybody listening to this is carbon. Everything biological is carbon. Stop the self-hate. The system is the problem. And I think that what's what we've been trying to highlight today is like, what's the existing system and what's the alternative system? Let's address the real issue at its root and not allow ourselves to be victims of, these lies and misleading fake news facts that are working against our interests.
Since we invented a new word in this podcast, what was that one that you created?
Extinctionist?
Extinctionism.
I did not invent that.
Let's invent another term to Robby's point. We'll call it carbon derangement syndrome.
Okay.
Becoming just singularly focused on carbon.
There's a lot of those people.
Yeah. All right, friends and lovers. Which one? Lover, friend.
Yeah, not plural. For clarity.
Thanks. Okay, let's just go onward into the world and do good things. Until next time.
Adios.
Adios.
Ciao.